Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Mather. I'm with the Population Reference Bureau. I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar on ACS data for small geographic areas and population subgroups. Before we get started, I wanted to provide a few words of introduction because there's been tremendous interest in the American Community Survey, and the Population Reference Bureau and Sabre Systems are working in partnership with the Census Bureau to develop a new ACS data users group to help data users connect with each other about important issues. So later this summer, we're going to be launching an online community that's going to enable ACS data users to connect online and discuss key ACS data issues and topics. We're also going to be organizing a data users conference that will be held next spring in Washington, D.C., so stay tuned for more information about that. One of the other activities is a series of webinars that we're organizing focused on ACS data. Today's webinar is oriented towards novice or intermediate level data users, but we'll have others that are in the future that are oriented more towards expert users. With that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker today. This is Tim Gilbert. He's a survey statistician from the U.S. Census Bureau, and he's going to provide a short overview of ACS data for small geographic areas and population groups.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark said, my name is Tim Gilbert, and I'm from the American Community Survey Office here at the U.S. Census Bureau, and today I'm going to go through a quick overview of the American Community Survey and how it relates to small geographic areas and small population subgroups. So, the American Community Survey is a large national survey that collects data from approximately 3.5 million addresses annually to produce detailed population and housing estimates each year. The survey covers the resident population of the United States and Puerto Rico for those people living in housing units and those living in group quarters. And group quarters are living arrangements that are owned or managed by an entity or organization such as dorms or correctional facilities. And the survey is also designed to produce critical information that was previously collected in the decennial census. The ACS was developed to focus the census on improving population count and to provide characteristic information more than once every 10 years in order to frame policy issues better. When thinking about the ACS in comparison to the 2010 decennial census, it's important to remember that the 2010 census provided official counts and population totals, while the ACS provides sample estimates and population characteristics. The decennial census occurs every 10 years and reflects a point in time, in particular one particular date, and the ACS occurs annually reflecting a period of time over which the data was collected. And in the case of the ACS, that's 1 year, 3 year, or 5 year data sets that we release. The 2010 census had one form sent to the entire U.S. population, and it asked questions to provide a basic count of the population and the most basic demographic and housing information, while the ACS collects more detailed characteristic information that was once collected on the decennial census long form. The American Community Survey data collection operation uses 4 modes: internet, mail, telephone, and personal visit that take place over a 3-month period. For most housing units, the first phase of data collection includes an invitation, which is mailed to the sample address, for the household to respond via the internet. If the household does not respond via the internet, a paper questionnaire is sent to the sample address for the household to complete and return by mail. If no response is received by mail or internet, the Census Bureau follows up with computer-assisted telephone interviewing if a telephone number is available for the address. If we're still unable to reach an occupant of the unit over the telephone, or if the household refuses to participate, the address may be selected for computer-assisted telephone interviewing. At any point during this process, any receipt of an internet response or a completed paper questionnaire from the sampled address results in the address being removed from the data collection workload. The content collected by the American Community Survey can be grouped into 4 main types of characteristics: social, economic, housing, and demographic. Social characteristics include topics such as education, marital status, grandparent caregivers, veterans, and disability status. Housing characteristics include topics such as tenure, occupancy and structure, housing value, utilities, and mortgage or monthly rent. The economic characteristics include such topics as income, benefits, employment status, occupation, commuting to work, and place of work. And the ACS also collects the basic demographic characteristics such as sex, age, race, and Hispanic origin. And that's the same type of information that will be collected by the decennial census. The ACS also produces estimates for many different geographic areas. The two main types of geographic areas are legal and administrative areas and statistical areas. Legal and administrative areas have legally described boundaries and may provide governmental services or may be used to administer programs, while statistical geographic areas are defined primarily for data tabulation and presentation purposes. And here's a list of a few examples of both types of areas. This diagram depicts the census geographic hierarchy. As you can see on the bottom, we have block groups that aggregate to census tracts, tracts to counties, counties to states, and so on up to the level of the nation. A block group will never cross a tract boundary, and a tract will never cross a county boundary, and counties never cross state boundaries, and so on. By extension of these nesting relationships, a block group never crosses county or state boundaries. Also, to either side of the central axis are geographic areas that do not nest within the levels of the geographic hierarchy below where the line connects them to the central axis. For instance, a place boundary, seen on the right side, connecting to state, may split a block group, a tract, or a county, but will never cross a state boundary. A zip code tabulation area, as seen on the top left, may cross all other geographic boundaries below this level of the nation. When thinking about specific geographic areas, it's important to know that not every geographic area will be available in every ACS dataset. We release ACS estimates in the form of 1-year, 3-year, and 5-year datasets. And by combining multiple years' worth of collected data, we can release estimates for smaller geographic areas. And as you can see in this table, ACS estimates are available for geographic areas with a population of 65,000 or more in the form of 1-year, 3-year, and 5-year estimates. ACS estimates are only available for geographic areas with a population from 20,000 to 64,999 in the form of 3-year and 5-year estimates, not 1 year. And ACS data is only available for areas with a population less than 20,000 through the 5-year estimates. Here you can see our tentative schedule for the release of the 2012 ACS data. Our 1-year estimates are tentatively scheduled to be released on September 19th of this year, the 3-year estimates on October 24th, and the 5-year estimates on December 5th. And for more information and updated information about data releases, you can visit the URL listed on this slide. The table on this slide shows the availability of certain selected geographic areas with smaller populations in the 1-, 3-, and 5-year American Community Survey datasets. As I mentioned earlier, population size of the geographic area determines in which dataset estimates will be available. For example, the first row here shows that there are a total of 3,221 counties and equivalents in the United States. 26% of those areas receive 1-year estimates from the 2011 American Community Survey. The 2009 to 2011 American Community Survey 3-year dataset contained estimates for 59% of those areas, and the 5-year dataset includes estimates for all 3,221 county and equivalent areas. You can also see here that the smallest geographic areas, block groups, and census tracts are only available through the 5-year estimates. And you can access a complete list of geographic areas published at the URL at the bottom of this slide. Now I'll talk briefly about some of the ways to access ACS estimates. American FactFinder, which can be found at factfinder2.census.gov, can be used to access almost any ACS estimates through pre-tabulated tables. However, estimates for the smallest geographic areas in the ACS block groups cannot be found in FactFinder. To access estimates for block groups, you need to use the Summary File. The ACS Summary File is a set of comma-delimited text files that contain all of the pre-tabulated detailed tables available. The Summary File is also the only source for block group estimates, and it can be accessed via the File Transfer Protocol, or FTP site, the Summary File Retrieval Tool, or through DataFerret. For more information about the Summary File and accessing ACS estimates through the Summary File, you can visit the URL listed below. The ACS Summary File technical document contains information on how to use the Summary File to access your tables of interest. A Appendix E of the technical documentation shown here provides a list of all detailed tables contained in the summary file and which of those tables are available at the block group level and which are not. Another way to access ACS estimates is by using the ACS Public Use Microdata Sample, or PUMS. And the PUMS is public use because it has been anonymized and it's downloadable. It's microdata because it represents records of individual people, and it's a sample, and it's a representative sample of the population. PUMS is also a subsample of the full ACS sample, and the smallest level of geography available in the public use microdata sample is the public use microdata area, or PUMA, which contains about 100,000 people. The ACS PUMS files are microdata, which are very different from the summary data that are available through American FactFinder in the summary file. Summary data and tables represent measures such as counts, averages, and medians for specific geographic areas such as states or counties, and they're available through predefined tables. In microdata files, the unit of analysis is the individual housing unit or person, and the records include actual questionnaire responses that have been anonymized. For example, the PUMS data show how respondents answered questions on education, occupation, and housing characteristics. And when working with microdata files, the data user specifies the tables to be produced. In using ACS PUMS, you can create tables that are not available through American FactFinder. The PUMS files are especially useful for studying smaller, unique population groups for which published tables may be limited. We also have a special data release for American Indian and Alaska Native and other selected populations from the 2010 ACS 5-year estimates. Selected population tables contain estimates of characteristics for selected race, Hispanic origin, tribal, and ancestry populations. And American Indian and Alaska Native tables contain estimates of characteristics for selected American Indian and Alaska Native tribal populations. The population size requirement for the selected population tables is that the population group must have a population of at least 7,000 at the national level for the table to be produced. And for the American Indian or Alaska Native group, they must have a population of at least 100 at the national level for the table to be produced. And for each geographic area, they must have at least 50 unweighted sample persons from the population group. And more information about accessing these tables can be found here at the URL listed. And that was my brief introduction to the ACS and overview of small geographic areas and populations, and I encourage you to contact us with any more questions you might have.
Great, thanks very much, Tim. For those of you who just joined, we are going to hold some of these questions that have come in to the end, so we make sure that the other presenters have time to speak. So I'm going to turn it over now to our second speaker, who is Laura Speer. Laura directs the Kids Count project at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and she's going to talk about how the foundation uses ACS data in their state and the national and state level policy work.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. As Mark said, I'm Laura Speer. I work at the Annie E. Casey Foundation on the Kids Count project there. We use the American Community Survey extensively in our work, and it truly is a great resource for child advocates across the country. So I'm happy to be here to talk about the work that we do with the American Community Survey. The Annie Casey Foundation is the largest private philanthropy in the U.S. that's specifically focused on improving lives for disadvantaged kids and families. And one of the longest-running initiatives, if not the longest-running initiative at the Casey Foundation, is Kids Count, which was initially created to provide decision-makers, policymakers, and people who could really make a difference for kids and families with non-biased, quality data on which to make their decisions. And so we've been doing Kids Count since 1990. There are two primary components of Kids Count, and I'm going to talk about both of them briefly, but then Frances Deviney, who is also going to follow me, is going to talk more about the state work. But I'm going to just kind of cover them both and then give you a couple of examples of how we've used the ACS specifically in our Kids Count work. So Kids Count is the National Kids Count Project and the State Kids Count Project. I work primarily on the National Kids Count Project, which is publications. We do multiple publications in a year. We just released the annual Kids Count Data Book, which is by far the most prominent publication that we do, and we've been doing that report since 1990, so for 25 years. We also do policy reports focused on specific issues that are critical for child well-being and recommendations that we think can be taken up to do something about it, and data snapshots. We have the Kids Count Data Center, which I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on later, because that is really where we're, I think, making the best use of the American Community Survey right now. And then we have a mobile site for the data centers to access all the information that's there, as well as a pretty prominent presence on social media. As I mentioned, we have the State Kids Count Network. Frances is on the call from the Center for Public Policy Priorities in Texas, but we've got a grantee and an organization who works on Kids Count in every state, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. You can kind of see from this map that they are different types of organizations. Most of them are state-level child advocacy organizations, but there are also universities in that in our network. I think many of them are on the call today, and many of our network folks are on the call today. But I wanted to put this up here because I want to make sure that those folks who have not heard of Kids Count or don't know the Kids Count grantee in your state, that you take a minute maybe after we stop talking, of course, so you're not doing it while we're paying attention to every word we're saying throughout the webinar, but that you take the time to find out who is doing Kids Count in your state, not only because they can be a great resource in terms of data and information in your research or in your policy work, but also because they are folks who are doing state-level data work and I know that, having been one of those people not that long ago, that there's a value in having colleagues that are doing similar types of work at the state level. So this is a little bit I just wanted to pick out a couple of things that we do with the ACS. As I mentioned, we use the American Community Survey a lot throughout our work. A couple of the most prominent places are in the Kids Count Data Book. We recently changed our index, but the way we do our data book is that we take 16 indicators of child well-being. They're divided up in 4 domains: economic well-being, education, health, and then family and community. And we rank states on those 16 indicators, and then we rank them within each domain. Of those 16 indicators in the new index, 9 come from the American Community Survey. They're primarily in the economic well-being, education, and family and community domains. Not too surprising since the other domain is health, but it really does say a little bit about how much we rely on the American Community Survey for our work. And the data book gets a lot of pickup across the country. Early estimates, we just released our report on June 24th, so it's only been about a week and a half, and there were more than 2,500 media stories across the country that covered the data book, both TV, radio, and newspaper, many of which highlighted the increase in the child poverty rate, which is an ACS indicator, in the headlines, even though the data is from the 2011 American Community Survey, which is now, we all know, something like 9 months old or 10 months old. But be that as it may, it's still news, and to many, which we were happy about because it's an important issue for us. We also did last year a data snapshot on children living in high poverty communities using the American Community Survey, and I'm going to go into a little more detail on that specific use in a minute. But those were a couple of the ways we used the American Community Survey in our publications. As I mentioned, the data center is where we have lots more data on kids and families, and it really is a resource for a wide range of people. We get about 800,000 visits to the data center in a year, We have about 4 million data points on the site, and they are data that both are collected by us at the national level, actually working with the Population Reference Bureau to collect the data, and our network of organizations in the states that get data from state agencies, but then they also do their own analysis of data from the American Community Survey and put it up on the data center. And I think Frances will probably talk about that later. But there are literally hundreds. I really didn't have time to count them all, the indicators on the data center that come from the American Community Survey. But there are at least 70 indicators at the state level that we use that we find to be valuable indicators of child and family well-being on the data center, and many, many more that our grantees and our organizations put up on the data center at the state, and at the county and school district and state legislative district and congressional district level. So just real briefly, I want to talk about the data snapshot on children in high poverty communities that we did with the Population Reference Bureau's help in February of 2012. The report was released. That report used the 2006 to 2010 ACS census tract level data, and it looked at census tracts with poverty rates higher than or equal to 30%. The findings from that report were that basically there are around 8 million children living in communities with high poverty rates, and that was a pretty substantial increase since 2000, which was a change from the previous decade, and I think something that hadn't been discussed very widely to that point. It's an important issue for the Casey Foundation because the community piece and community building is a big strand of our work. So this was something that our folks, beyond just our child advocacy folks, were very interested in. And so we were able to use the American Community Survey to do an analysis of the kids living in high poverty communities at the state level. We've compared it to the 2000 census. And we released the data with our network across the country in February. The report was cited in hundreds of stories across the country, and it really did bring attention to the increase in concentrated poverty since 2000, which was something that, again, it wasn't. I think that there wasn't a broad understanding about the fact that that trend had reversed, at least for kids, over that decade. And more importantly, from our perspective, it's been used by advocates to really raise the visibility of the effects of living in concentrated poverty on kids, and to secure resources for those communities. And part of what we did in that data snapshot was to highlight what we think recommendations are that can really make communities better places to raise kids. And so the other thing is that we added that indicator to our data book, and it's actually one of the data points in our family and community domain now. The map on the side there is the most recent version of that indicator, and it was created on the data center. And so I'm just going to wrap up by showing you all the new Kids Count Data Center. I'm going to try to go to the live site. And just because this is something else we did with the release of the data book, was to revamp the data center. So I want to just take a couple minutes to show you all this site, and hopefully it'll be a resource that you can find useful in your work. As I said, the data center has about 4 million data points on it, so it's got a lot of information at a lot of different levels of geography. You can access it by just typing in the indicator or the area or the location that you're interested in, and it'll give you some options to go to. You can select the state and drill down, go to it if you're looking for data for a particular county. You can find it there. You can also go in through the topics. You can kind of get a sense of the types of data that is on the site, and sign up for our email list, get on our Twitter account, Facebook, all that kind of stuff down there at the bottom. But I'm going to very quickly show you, and hopefully this is coming through okay, because I know when you go on live sites, sometimes on webinars it can get a little wonky. that I just clicked on Show U.S. Data. And I'm going to just pick one of the indicators that we include, and I'm going to show the state-level data for from the American Community Survey, which is the Children in Immigrant Families indicator. And this, we do a lot of work, and many of our groups in our network do a lot of work around the supports that are necessary for kids in immigrant families. And so this is a valuable measure, and we actually have many more indicators just related to this subgroup from the American Community Survey on the site, including the education status of kids in immigrant families, their poverty levels, and things like that. I'm just going to quickly show you one, which is just the basic indicator around the number and the rate of children living in immigrant families at the state level. You can see you get this table, and you can kind of rank it very easily. And if you click on map, you get the map of the U.S. Or of states in the U.S. With this data. And you can take this map and save it, put it into a PowerPoint like I did in the previous slide very easily. You can share it on Facebook and Twitter up here. You can get actually didn't mean to click on that. You can get the raw data and download it and use it for your purposes. So, so I wanted to just very quickly show you all the site, and hopefully it can be a resource for you as you're in your own data work at the state level. And if there are any, if you have a question about the data on the data center or anything that I talked about, you should feel free to contact me directly. My email is there at the bottom, and my phone number. You can also reach out directly to any of the organizations listed as the Kids Count Network organization in your state. You can find their contact information on the data center as well. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Great. Thanks very much, Laura.
Sure.
Our final speaker is Frances Deviney, who directs the Kids Count project at the Center for Public Policy Priorities in Texas. And Frances is going to talk about some of the work they do in using the ACS at the state and local level.
So thank you very much for having me. As Mark and Laura both said, the Center for Public Policy Priorities is the grantee for Texas for the state Kids Count project. And so we've had the Kids Count project since 1993, and it's an important part of, as the Kids Count project nationally is an important part of what Annie E. Casey is trying to achieve with children in families nationally, we are trying to do here in Texas. And the Center for Public Policy Priorities uses hard facts and rigorous analysis, and we use that information to educate the public and elected officials, to advocate for changes in laws and also policy at the local level to improve the lives of children and families. And ultimately our goal is to make a better Texas. And Kids Count is an incredibly important part of that, because even though the internet is easily accessible and you've got all this data available to you, a lot of people still feel like the pathways to get there are a little onerous and a little intimidating. And so Kids Count makes it easy to get the information you need. I'm just going to share with you a couple of things that we have done with the American Community Survey using that kind of smaller geographic level data. Every year, as you saw earlier in the census presentation, every year data is released from the American Community Survey, and the one-year data is released typically in September, and you can get information for areas of 65,000 people or more. And so we put out information about particularly poverty and health insurance and how the data looks for Texas every year. And so we've historically done reports looking at kind of the top 10 issues that came up for Texas in the American Community Survey. And as you can see from the front page of this report, we were able to look and use the American Community Survey to determine that Texas has 12 of the 20 worst poverty rates among the U.S. metropolitan areas. And we were able to look at how poverty differed by age in the chart below, where we were able to look over time and by age group how poverty had been changing for Texans. And that little pull-out quote came from this graph which we made from the American Community Survey. And I'm actually going to show you how we got to this point. And this is a particularly important context for us to be able to talk about all of the other kids count data, because kind of coming from the tradition of the Annie E. Casey Foundation and also from our own tradition at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, we believe that when you're talking about outcomes for children, you're really talking about kids in the context of family and community. And unfortunately, so much of that is driven by poverty. So poverty and uninsured rates and those kind of things are really critically important, and the ACS plays an important role for us to being able to describe and give context to all of the other information like nutritional access and those kinds of things. So we were able to pull data from the American Community Survey that looks at several different metro areas across the country and compare them to our largest metro areas here in Texas. I'll come back to this in just a moment. I also just wanted to quickly share another place where we use the American Community Survey, again in conjunction with Population Reference Bureau. We actually developed recently a new online tool specifically for Texas. It's called the Better Texas Family Budgets, and you can find it at familybudgets.org. And it estimates how much families need to be able to make ends meet and to kind of have a safe and basic and healthy lifestyle in Texas. And you can change it based on family size and other different variables. And if you scroll down on our website, you'll see that it shows how many families can actually make the budgets that we describe, and that is based on the American Community Survey data. And so what we were able to see, if we go back for a second, for in this particular family that we chose for 2 adults and 2 children living in Dallas, they needed to make $47,000 to be able to make ends meet. And so we used the American Community Survey to determine how many families actually were met that $47,000 income cutoff. And it's a really nice opportunity to talk about when families don't make enough to make ends meet, as we've described it, basic food, basic health insurance coverage, renting an apartment. Then it opens the opportunity to talk about what are the solutions that we can make, what are the changes we can make at the local and the state levels to be able to support families when they aren't able to make ends meet. So that's just kind of a policy way that we have used some of the American Community Survey data. The biggest thing I want to share with you guys today is when you approach the American Community Survey data, how do you get the information you need? Now, the first thing I would say is go to the Kids Count Data Center. If you want information on kids and families, the Kids Count Data Center that Laura shared is one of the best ways to get a lot of really great, already cleaned up American Community Survey data that's been kind of nicely parsed out by race and ethnicity and immigration status. And so I would visit that first. But sometimes you may find that there's a geography that you want that's not listed in the data center, or there's a different kind of breakout by age that you want that you don't see on the data center. And you may want to go directly to the source yourself. So I'm going to walk you through how we got to that metro area chart. And when you go to the American Community Survey site the first time, it can be a little overwhelming. But like anything, with a little practice, it becomes very easy. So the first thing you have to do when you go to the American FactFinder site, which we were shown the site for that earlier, you can just Google FactFinder or American FactFinder, you got to have a plan about what you want. It's kind of like Google, okay? So on the very first page, when you go to kind of the advanced search part, you can type in a topic or a table name right there in the top, and it's really quite like Google. Type in anything you want. Let's say we're going to type in child. Okay, so you don't really have a big plan. You just kind of think, I want to look at some child data. You type in child, and if you don't have more of a plan than that, a search for child yields 11,146 tables. And this is probably how you feel. And that's how I feel. You don't want to go through 11,146 tables looking for what you need. So filters will save you, okay? And that's how, when you're going to the American FactFinder site, that's how you're going to know, get down to the tables you really want, that you really need. So what does that mean? What are filters? Well, you know most of the time that you want data for a specific geographic area. And in this case, we're going to focus on the smaller geographic area since that's the topic of the webinar today. But you can start with your geographic area. You don't have to start with geography. You can start with the kind of data you're looking for, maybe about poverty or something like that. or you know you want data from a specific year. But for today, we'll say start with your geographic area. You also need to understand some of the tricky terms, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And part of that is just about using and practicing, but knowing some of the basic terms helps. Then selecting a specific data set really makes a big difference because, again, you'll see in a second, there's a lot of information available to you in the American Community Survey, well, both in the American Community Survey and in the American FactFinder. And then when you get really savvy, you can actually search for a specific table number. That's a little bit more of an advanced use of it, but once you've used it once or twice and you start writing down or keeping notes somewhere of what tables you tend to go back to time and again, having those specific table numbers will speed your process dramatically. So let's first look at starting with your geographic area and knowing your terms. So we're back to that main page again. And again, you know, I know we're kind of moving through this. You will have access to this presentation. You'll have access to the recording, so you don't need to necessarily write down all the notes right now. You'll be able to go back and look at it and basically use this as a step-by-step manual if you want later on. So we're back on the home page, and the first thing we want to do, we're going to start with our geography. So right there on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a geography tab, and if you click on that, it'll open up another little window that comes above what you were already looking at, and it shows you all the different geographies that you can access from any of the surveys that are on American FactFinder. So let's go down. We'll look at a few of them. So zoom in there a little bit. You can pull things by county. You can pull things by place. Now this is I think a good example of those tricky terms that are used in the Census Bureau sometimes. Place is equivalent to city or village or town, any of those kind of smaller units, geographic units that are basically what you would call a city are under place. And I think a lot of people don't realize that's what that word means. So place, congressional district, if you're trying to look for information to influence your elected officials. Zip code tabulation area, again, one of those tricky terms. The 5-digit zip code, which you see underneath the arrow there, is only available for the decennial census, so the one that comes out every 10 years. The 5-digit zip code tabulation area is not exactly the zip code, but it's pretty close. But they make that distinction because they don't want you to think it's going to be exactly down to every single little house falling within those same boundaries. But for most people's purposes, it's close enough that you're going to get what you need. So you can get 5-digit zip code areas, and then you can also get the metropolitan areas. So places like the Los Angeles metropolitan area or Dallas or the New York area. And that differs from city because like in New York, it would include some of the boroughs as well, whereas if you were just looking at city, it would be New York City itself. So let's take a look. Let's say we're going to select metropolitan statistical area because we're interested in those kind of bigger metro areas. We click on that, and then it shows you all the metro areas that are available to you. So, and it's all mixed across the states. So if you kind of scroll down through there, you can find, and we're going to look for and find Houston. Since I'm in Texas, I get to pick. So we're going to pick Houston, and you'll notice it goes up in your selections box. Okay, great. So now we know we're going to find data on the Houston, Sugar Land, Baytown metro area. And Houston is the largest metro area in Texas. So we're going to have a lot of data options because you have a lot of people there, and so we're going to have many choices in terms of the data we can use. The good side of that is we've got choices. The bad side is we've got a lot of choices. You can see from that arrow there, we have 20,401 tables that have data about the Houston metro area. That's a little too many. So let's do a little filtering again. If you look here on the right, you'll see that the American Community Survey has different years and different estimates and different tables. And you'll see that there are 1-year estimates and 3-year estimates and 5-year estimates. So before we start narrowing down there, let's go ahead and add another geographic area. Let's say I'm also interested in Alice, Texas, the Alice metro or micro area. Alice is kind of a smaller city in Texas, and let's say I live in Alice, and I'm really interested in how Alice compares to Houston. So I'm going to select Alice from the geographic area like we did before. Click on that, and it will go up in my search selections. Click. And now I get the tables that just have data on Houston and Alice. So you can see we've actually halved the number of tables, still too many to look at, but we've got about 10,000 tables. And now if we look, we've now got only data from the 3- and the 5-year American Community Survey. The reason is because Alice is too small. Alice does not have 65,000 people. Alice has actually about 40,000 people. So they weren't big enough to be included in the 1-year estimates. So we're already narrowing down here a little bit. Now let's go to the next round of filters. Let's select a specific data set, and then we'll talk about how to search for specific tables within that, and I'll talk about table numbers. So next we're going to search for the specific data set. We saw that we had the 2011 American Community Survey from the 3-year averages and the 5-year averages. And so the way you get to that, and this is one of those tricky terms again, if you want to select for a specific data set or specific year, you're going to go under the Topics tab on the left. So when you click on Topics, it'll open up another little window, and then you'll open up the plus sign next to Data Set, which we already see here, and you can click specifically on whether you want just 3-year estimates or 5-year estimates. The reason this is valuable and important is because you're going to help narrow down your tables again, but you're also going to make a choice here about increasing the reliability of your data. Because you have such a small little geography that you're looking at, Alice, which is only about 40,000 people, you could choose 3-year estimates because it's an option, but if you want to make sure you have the most reliable and valid data that you can get, 5-year estimates are going to give you the best option that you have. So you can click on that 5-year estimates tab, which is what we're going to do here. Click right there. And now we're down to, so we've got 5-year estimates only left, so our filter worked. And now we're down to less than 1,000 tables. Again, still too many, but we're definitely narrowing it down. This is how our filters are helping us out. Okay, so we're getting there. Next, we're going to look at how you can select for different kinds of tables. Now, these are some tables, and again, you'll have access to these numbers. These are some tables that I tend to go back to time and again, where you're looking at poverty, poverty by age, poverty by race or ethnicity, poverty by, and again, one of those tricky words is nativity. Nativity tells you whether a person is born in the United States, has become a naturalized citizen, or was born outside of the United States. There's educational attainment, which means how much, what they graduated with. Did they graduate with a high school degree? Do they have no degree? Do they have a college degree? So these are some of those table numbers that I tend to go back to time and time again and that I used for our paper. So let's say we're interested in this primary table up at the top, and it's poverty by sex by age, which is your basic poverty table. So we'll go in here, and you can type in right at the top where it says refine your search results, and you can type in that table number directly. Now you also could type in other things. You could type in poverty, you could type in child, and those will get you where you want to go. But if you happen to know your table number, once you become more experienced, it's going to take you exactly to where you need to be. So we'll type in B17001 right there, and it will give you exactly the table you need. Poverty status in the past 12 months by sex and age. So you click on that, and it gives you these really nice tables in HTML on your screen. You think, this is beautiful, that's great. Now what do I do with it? Well, what you do if you want to, you can either have a PDF of it, you can print what's on your screen, you can copy and paste it, but they have a really nice option where you can download this information so you can actually work with it yourself. You can create your own graphs and charts and those kinds of things. And so I usually go into download, and then I will choose, again, you can see that there are different operations. You can get a comma delimited file, which means you can open up it in lots of different formats. If you use SAS or other statistical packages, you can open it up in there easily. I do a lot of work in Excel, Microsoft Excel, so I click on Excel right there. And then it opens up the table almost exactly as you saw it online in an Excel spreadsheet. And then you can start playing with it. And you can get that data by poverty by age of person, or poverty by gender, or poverty by your different geographic areas, comparing Alice to Houston. Now, one thing I want to point out here that nobody's mentioned yet is even with this great data, because you start breaking the data out into smaller and smaller groups, so we have poverty numbers by kids under 5, or we have poverty numbers for kids who are exactly 5 years old. The data gets really small, and as you can see in Alice, Texas, if you look for boys who are 5 years old who are living in poverty, there's 55 kids. If you look at the number right to the right of that, can you see my arrow, Mark?
Yes.
Okay. If you look to the number right to the right of that, oops, sorry, you can see that it says plus or minus 46. That means that it could be 101 kids who live in poverty, or it could be 9 kids in poverty. And 55 is just kind of the best estimate. So when you start getting really, really small, even though we've done the best we could, we've picked the 5-year numbers, we've tried to get really reliable data, and the ACS does a great job of making sure they get really good samples and good reliable data. Sometimes the data still can be to the swing between whether the top and the bottom end of the possible range of that data can still be too big. So you need to take a close look at that. And one of the things I learned from the Population Reference Bureau was that if that number over here, that 46, plus or minus 46, is 10% or larger of the number you're actually interested in, it's probably not a good number to use. It's too unreliable. You can get past that by combining years of age, things like that. But it's just something you want to pay attention to. Because Houston's so big, you don't have that problem. We've got, nearly 6 million people in Houston alone. So you're not going to have that problem with Houston. So we used that table, and we pulled a whole bunch of different metro areas, and we were able to calculate the overall poverty and, in this case, uninsured rates from the data from the American Community Survey. And we were able to create this table once we pulled it down. It seems like a lot of steps, but once you practice it, it's very methodical, and you'll do the same. You'll take the same steps almost every single time, and you'll be able to get comfortable with using that format. Once we found that data, we actually were able to not only create our wonky bar charts, but we also were able to create some really nice infographics that we used on social media, where it said 4 out of the 5 poorest metro areas in the country are in Texas. This is what we used last year. 4 out of 5 U.S. metro areas with the highest share of uninsured are in Texas. And all of this data came from the American Community Survey release. So you can do some creative social media things with the American Community Survey as well. The last thing I'll close with is there's different tables that you can look at that also provide percentages for you. If you noticed in that last table, it only had the estimates, so the counts, the estimated counts. Most of the time, the Census Bureau does not recommend that you use kind of count data. They really like for you to talk about it as percentages because they are estimates. And so there are tables that provide that for you. So as we saw here, there's the tables that start with a D, which is the kind of demographic tables, and like the subject tables. You can get some of those percentages already calculated for you. So it's just a matter of kind of exploring. One final thing, like Friends, filters can also lead you astray. So as we were talking about earlier, when I pulled this table, I put in the table number. If I'd not done that and I just put in child, I wouldn't have gotten this table, even if I was interested in child poverty. The reason is if you look at this table, nowhere on this page is the word child. Nowhere in there, even though we're talking about people under 5 years old who are clearly children. So sometimes, depending on the words you use, you may end up getting a big bonk and you get an error rate and saying we don't have any tables that fit that, and you're like, I know they have poverty tables on kids. So what I would recommend is to make sure that when you're going through this, you just try out different filters, try out different things, and don't be afraid if you get an error to back off some of those less important filters if you know something is there. So to sum up, you want to have a plan. You want to use filters, but focus on just starting with the primary ones, like your geography, or maybe even, if you've got it, a table number. Don't give up if the filters lead you astray. Just back off the ones that the last one you tried. And then don't be afraid to ask for help. What's amazing is that when I call this big government agency, the Census Bureau, I get people on the phone. And it's not because I'm special or important. It's because they do their job well. And so I call the Census call center, and I actually get to talk to real-life people, and it kind of freaks me out every time. And I really encourage you to do that as well if you run into problems or you have questions about data that you're looking for. If you have any questions about using kind of local data, I definitely would encourage you to contact me or your state Kids Count person. They are all well-versed in the areas of the American Community Survey data, and I'm sure would be very happy to help you out. And you also are more than welcome to contact me, even if you're not from Texas. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Frances. We do have a few minutes left for questions, and we have had quite a few questions come in, so I'm just going to go through some of these, and many of them are related to kind of more technical issues related to the ACS, questions about the ACS data, so it may be that Tim, you may be the best person to answer some of these. There's one question here about if someone were interested in getting access to microdata, essentially getting PUMS-like data below the PUMA level, are there any options for people to do that, especially if a person is not in academia?
Probably not if you're not in academia. We do have a process where you can request a special tabulation or request access through a data center, a census data center, and we have information on the website. You can search for that. But those cost a lot of money and have a lot of hoops you have to go through because they're really geared for large-scale research endeavors. So really, the PUMA is the lowest, easily accessible level of microdata.
Okay. And someone wanted clarification that wondering if the ACS is just limited to the civilian population, is the group quarters population included, military barracks, and so on?
Yes, through the collection of information through group quarters now as well. We do cover both populations, and usually the table, through the universe statements in the table titles, you'll be able to determine which populations or both that the table and the estimates are referring to.
Okay. There's a question about how the annual population estimates produced by the Census Bureau feed into the ACS census tract level estimates. So I think there's a question about the population controls that are used to construct census tract estimates.
Right. I'm not extremely well versed on how the population controls affect ACS estimates, but I do know that we do always refer, if you're interested in population totals, to either use decennial census counts, because those are not estimates, those are actual counts, or population estimates for just basic estimates of the population, and then using ACS data, as Frances was just talking about, to talk about the characteristics of that population and using percentages. And but I could research and look into that, or I encourage you to, whoever proposed that question, to call the census call center, and that could get filtered to us for a more in-depth answer to the population controls.
Okay. Can someone say a few words about geography such as school districts or congressional districts in terms of the completeness of those data, I guess? It's kind of a general question about those, some of those geographies that people may not use as often.
Right. I can start out by quickly talking about, there was a chart that I showed in my presentation about the geographies that were available, the percentages of all those geographies that were available in the 1 year, the 3 year, and the 5 year. And there's a more complete chart on our website at the URL listed on that slide.
Okay. There's also several questions that have come in about the reliability of the tract level data. And I might just say something about that, because we have at PRB, we've worked a lot with small area data, tract level data. And the one thing about the tract level data is there's no hard and fast rule about how reliable does it have to be good enough. And so the Census Bureau doesn't provide any formula or something like that to say that this estimate is good and that one is bad. It's really up to the data user, I think, and depends in part on your purposes in terms of figuring out whether an estimate is good enough. But I will say that we've encouraged people when they're working with very small geographies like tracts, if there are opportunities to combine those tracts into slightly larger geographic areas, so if you have some other geography that can combine 2 or 3 tracts together, that can really make a big difference in terms of the reliability of those data. And in addition to that, Frances showed you some of those very detailed poverty tables by sex and age, and I would say that it's good to use broader categories in constructing those types of poverty estimates if you can. So instead of just focusing on kids under age 5, male kids under age 5, if it's possible to use a larger category of kids, the broader the better in terms of getting more reliable data. And Tim, I don't know if you, or Laura, or Frances, if you have anything else to add to that.
Well, I think that was good advice. And if there's anybody who has got, I mean, this is something that we always struggle with, and that we're always looking for good examples of how what is good enough. So, but I think your advice was good.
And I think we'll probably schedule another webinar. This is a topic that's a lot of people are interested in, so we may schedule a webinar later focused specifically on that issue and how to deal with margins of error in the ACS.
Great.
I want to thank all of our panelists for providing lots of useful information about the ACS data and how it's being used. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and that concludes today's webinar.